Good afternoon, everybody. Neil from Vology. I'm the Enterprise Group Product Manager. I am very pleased to have gathered the guests that we have here today. We have several of them from many vendors, all of which you guys have probably heard of before. And they are very distinguished friends that have worked with us for quite a while. And I'm excited to introduce them to you. The first person is Jordan Goldman from Citrix. He's a technical analyst. Jordan, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Citrix?
Hey, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Jordan Goldman. I'm a technical analyst here at Citrix, and I work with the inside and field sales teams to kind of support our enterprise customers, certainly from a mobility stance or a virtualization stance, both in and outside of the field.
Thank you, Jordan. That's great. Our next esteemed guest is James McNeil, Senior Systems Engineer with Nutanix. James, can you tell us what you do at Nutanix?
James is muted, I believe.
I believe so.
All right, James. Apparently, James is having some technical issues. We'll come back to James in a moment. Let's get over to Michael Tuttle. Michael from Juniper, Senior Partner Account Manager over at Juniper. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about what you do over at Juniper?
I can. Thank you for having me today. My name is Michael Tuttle. My primary responsibility is to provide training, enablement, program services to our partner community, Vology being our lead partner here in Florida, and that's in a nutshell what I do. Thank you for having me today.
Our pleasure. Our next guest is Terry Henry from Brocade. Terry is a Senior Systems Engineer. Terry, can you tell us a little bit about what you do over at Brocade?
Sure, thanks for having me. I'm the Senior Systems Engineer, as you said. I cover our channel partners throughout the state of Florida, and I cover distribution for all of North America. Great.
Stephen Deming, Partner Technology Strategist from Microsoft.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well. Tell us about what you do.
So I'm part of our East Region field support team. I provide technical support for our customers and partners, specifically to help customers and partners understand where Microsoft technology is today, where it's going in the future, and ultimately how to better engage with Microsoft.
That's great. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, are some of my fellow Vologians. Jason Welsh, the world's tallest product manager. Jason, can you tell us what you do over here at Vology?
Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, I am a very tall product manager, but no, I'm one of Neil's colleagues, and I manage several of the virtualization product lines here at Vology. So very happy to be with you guys here this afternoon.
That's great. Jason's going to play the co-host role with us, so we hopefully Jason will get an opportunity to talk to a few of you guys and ask you a few additional questions. And then last and certainly not least, world-famous solutions architect from Vology, possibly the prettiest engineer on the planet, Kevin Reynolds. Kevin, can you tell us what you do over at Vology?
Oh, Neil, what a fantastic introduction. Thank you. And for what it's worth, you only say that because it's true. So my name is Kevin Reynolds. I'm one of the senior solutions architects here with Vology. I play in the data center, so server storage and virtualization primarily. That's what we do.
Well, that sounds good, Kevin. So I'm going to point the first question at you. So if you could give us sort of a high-level explanation or definition, essentially, of what virtualization actually is.
Sure. So virtualization, realistically, is nothing more than software that provides an abstraction layer between the hardware and the operating system, if you will. So it essentially slides in between the hardware and the operating system, and it tricks the operating systems into believing that they have their own dedicated hardware resources. So it essentially allows us to condense our hardware platform by running many virtual machines on top of a single piece of hardware.
Well, that's interesting, right? So one of the more interesting pieces that will open up as dialogue continues is that this idea of virtualization is gone much further than just servers, right? It may have started there. Actually, may have started someplace else. Why don't I point the next question to Jordan? Jordan's with Citrix. Citrix is really one of the founders of commercialized virtualization, so I think probably the right person to ask the question. Jordan, can you give us sort of a high-level timeline on the history of virtualization? Is this something that's brand new?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So to kind of figure out where we are today, right, it's really important to trace it back to the roots of virtualization. So a long, long time ago in a data center far away, basically we had these massive computers that could only handle a single task. Now, granted, they could handle that task very well, but basically as the times changed, these computers grew stronger and stronger, the technology evolved and evolved, so processors became more and more important, but they were still handling that one task. Now we kind of transition over to where the virtualization came in and advancements in that, right? So virtualization solved the problem of overcrowded data centers, of underutilized CPUs, and also allowed each virtual machine to act in its own instance in isolation. So great for scalability, great for on-demand adding of network resources. Now if we look at kind of an early time frame, I mentioned that it started in the early 1960s, and it actually was a project by IBM. So a little company called IBM, we may know them, started it actually in the 1964 era, and they wanted to design a computer that would allow a computer to do multitask at once, as well as allow multiple users to interact with that server in the same time. Now we fast forward a little bit down the road to 1972, we actually have a concept of virtual memory, so allowing the processor to handle more than one task simultaneously. Fast forward a few more years down the road, we actually have the founding of Microsoft by Bill Gates up in the 1975, and then Intel actually released a 8086 chip that would support a guest operating system. At the time, it ran Microsoft MS-DOS. Fast forward a little bit more, Citrix is founded by an IBM developer, Eddie Akabuchi, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. But basically, he had this kind of idea and theme to really allow multiple users to connect to a session, leverage an operating system at the same time. So Citrix and Microsoft have always been very key players in the virtualization space. We have a very strategic partnership. And now we kind of fast forward to 2003. The University of Cambridge releases the first open source hypervisor called Zen, later acquired by Citrix. And now, modern day, present day, we have this tremendous advancement in virtualization technology, enterprise mobility, enterprise flexibility, workplace reinventions, software-defined data centers, and I think that's actually a good point to even hand it off to James to talk about some of the types of virtualization that exist.
Well, hey, I guess you're great at reading minds, Jordan. That's exactly who we were going to go to next. James, how are we? Is your mic okay now?
Can you guys hear me now?
Beautiful. We can hear you. So everybody, let me formally introduce the esteemed gentleman in a similar background as mine with the goofy headset on. That is James with Nutanix. James, why don't you tell us first a little bit about what you do for Nutanix before I ask you this question?
Absolutely. So yep, my name's James McNeil. I'm a senior systems engineer with Nutanix, which is basically a nice title for a pre-sales engineer. So I'm responsible for the Florida territory and as well as Bermuda, basically driving the technical side of the sales process, as well as doing some post-sales installation type work and working with new customers to get things ramped up.
Great. So another propeller head. So we got a handful of those here, right? So James, let me ask you. I think this is really a relevant question for Nutanix. Because one of the problems that Nutanix or any converged solution is trying to do is break down silos, right? So one of the things that comes to mind after we get an overview of virtualization and maybe some ideas on history, what types of virtualization exist out there? How would you sort of categorize them?
So I think I'd really categorize it. I'd start with, I guess, server virtualization. So, today we're kind of at the point now where the standard is to virtualize, right? Most organizations have that virtualize first mindset, and then go to physical if it's something that can't be virtualized. Which there's not much left today that can't be. It's oftentimes, I guess, now we're calling it private cloud. And today, over 50% of server workloads are virtualized. Gartner sees that going to 86% by 2016. So it's clear that's where the market's going, and that's server virtualization is a matured use case for virtualization. We have desktop virtualization now, and I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we consistently hear, this is the year of EDI, this is the year of EDI. And each year we get more and more penetration into that VDI space, typically adopted for that, ease of management of the desktops, bringing that security model in place where your actual desktops live inside the walls of your data center, reducing the cost of these upgrades. And then I think, to Citrix's point, the whole BYOD initiative really drives that VDI use case as well for virtualization. A couple of the newer spaces I see with types of virtualization that are starting to become more and more relevant is the idea of software-defined networking, where we're basically abstracting that underlying physical network infrastructure and putting all the services in that software layer above these commodity network gear, and really just making that data center fully programmable, being able to centrally manage our networking stack from these software-defined networking controllers in your data center, and having that view of the entire data center, from one pane of glass. VMware bought Nicira and rolled that into their NSX platform. Cisco with ACI, a couple of the big players in that space. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And then storage. So the idea of abstracting the storage functionality into the actual software layer that lives above, essentially, their commodity gear, or really just not even caring what that underlying network gear is. Virtualizing it and putting the functionality of enterprise storage like dedupe, compression, thin provisioning, replications, snapshots in that actual, virtualizing that and putting that in that software layer.
It's interesting to hear you mention that, Jim. And first of all, before I go on, despite what Neil says, the headset looks fantastic. No, because I've heard a lot about the others, but maybe not so much about the software-defined storage part of it. So let me ask Kevin, because I know Kevin's pretty close to this. Give us some more detail on software-defined storage, if you can.
So it's actually really exciting stuff. Essentially what it does is it same principle as virtualization at the server or at the desktop level. It's going to take your physical storage and it presents it virtually up to the hypervisor and gives us a lot more capability, flexibility, and resiliency as far as what we want to do and how we want to carve up our storage. So not only is it presenting similar hardware platforms, but you can also leverage disparate hardware platforms. So, say you have several different storage platforms that you need to essentially combine the capabilities of it, right? It allows you to pool that storage logically and present it to your hypervisor as a single pane of storage, if you will. The other thing that it really allows us to do is it allows us to get very flexible as far as what we're doing at the software layer, right? So as James was saying, we can introduce things like virtualized deduplication and compression and sequentializing data at the software layer. Again, it gives us a lot more flexibility as far as what we're able to do with the same hardware platform.
Yeah, and I think we initially started off where a lot of these services started as hardware, right? So look back to the days of iSCSI, right? You'd have an iSCSI card inside your server to provide that feature. Deduplication, there's hardware acceleration out there for that. Now we're taking all those services and we're moving them into that software layer. And as we kind of ride Moore's law, we're able to provide the compute resources to do it in the software stack instead of providing dedicated hardware for those features.
And I think that's really a great point, James. And I think that we could even extend this. This is probably one of the more important topics to us, right? As we go over each of the silos, there's some things that are occurring on the networking side with virtualization too, right? I'd like to ask the question on network virtualization. And Terry, I know we're a little bit out of line, but I'd like to get some input from you as well, because we're starting to see this network virtualization pick up a little bit in the sense of where you can now carve up a network card out of a device, right? And you can actually carve it up into 4, 10 gig ports that'll perform different functions. I mean, maybe you can add some insight. We went on storage a little bit. I think networking's an interesting topic before we move to the next one. Do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Sure. I think networking is probably the last of all the major technologies in the data center to be virtualized, and you know, the ability to slice your network switches or routers or network cards into multiple what look like physical devices is a major coup, and to have your network devices aware, VM aware, to understand where those VMs are at any given time, so you can move a VM from port to port or switch to switch or data center to data center, and the settings follow it, and you know, the network is aware, so someone doesn't have to go in and do a manual configuration every time you vMotion a server. Is just critical and beyond what we had in the past.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing stuff. I think our director of technical services says these things work automatically. I think that's where we're going, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff has become quite amazing and automatic, and our lives as IT professionals, from a management perspective, is becoming easier as a result of it. So I do have another question, and Stephen, I'd like to point this one at you. There seems to be a lot of let's say a lot of vibration on virtualization, right? There's a lot of chatter, a lot of talk. Where do you think some of the confusion comes from? What are some of the major misconceptions that are talked about when it comes to virtualization? And I'm going to throw this one in there. Cloud, right? So there's a large discussion. It could be centered around the vagueness of cloud. You know, what is the cloud and where the heck is it?
And we've already made reference to it in this conversation. I mean, the reference to private cloud. When is it private cloud? When is it public cloud? Where does virtualization fit in that? So just when I start this kind of conversation, I always like to start using a definition of what the cloud is. And so for me, I use a definition out of Wikipedia that cloud computing refers to the on-demand provisioning of computational resources, whether they're data or software, via computer network rather than local computers. Now, in a very fancy way, there are three really important points made in that statement. First of all, on-demand, the fact that with cloud computing, we expect to be able to scale up our services and scale down our services based on need. That they're computational services. They could be data, as the internet was originally primarily a hoster of data, but more recently the internet has become a hoster of functionality as well as of software. And then lastly, via a network, not necessarily local, but somewhere else. So when I'm talking about virtualization and I'm talking about cloud, in a sense they're almost interchangeable conversations, but I use those 3 points of definition to really make it clear. Do we know where these resources are hosted? Do we know, are they scalable in units of servers, or are they scalable based on what people need? And I think that's part of the confusion between those two terms, that in virtualization, we're virtualizing a server, and if I'm utilizing that server to its fullest capacity, perfect. But if I'm utilizing that server at 110% of its capacity, what I'm going to need is I'm going to need to virtualize a completely separate server in order to get enough capacity to do what I need to do. I view that as being classic virtualization. Whereas in the cloud, what we really expect out of the cloud, when I go from that 100% to that 110%, I expect just an additional 10%. I actually expect to be charged just for an additional 10%. And it's actually one of the places where Microsoft has spent a lot of its time. We do Hyper-V as our primary virtualization tool for classic server virtualization, on-premises virtualization, what you might call private cloud virtualization. And we use Windows Azure for our cloud virtualization, because Windows Azure was designed for that incremental scalable capability. So I think one of the big misconceptions is that they're the same. And the reality is cloud virtualization is and should be a little different than classic on-premises server virtualization, that they do play different roles and they do have different requirements in the environment, and hopefully deliver different services.
Thanks, Stephen. This is Michael Tuttle with Juniper. I'd actually like to add on to that as well, some of the misconceptions on cloud and virtualization. A lot of people are very, very concerned about the security challenges, and when you remove control of the assets you're trying to protect from a physical device and moving it into the virtual world, that security is a concern, and that can't be further from the truth. The traditional security companies out there, from the software security companies to major manufacturers such as Juniper Networks, have all invested tremendous resources into securing your data, securing your applications that are out there in a virtualized environment and cloud environments. And the exciting part for the technology world out there is it's also created a whole new category of startups creating new technologies to help secure the cloud, secure your applications, and secure the assets that you've moved into a virtualized cloud environment.
That's actually interesting input. You know, based on what you guys said, Kevin, let me ask you a question. Maybe you could help give us a high-level understanding of public cloud, private cloud, and then this word hybrid cloud. Do you maybe have a use case scenario so that some of our listeners can get a feel for, you know, how we might want to define that? And of course, the rest of you folks on the roundtable, feel free to jump in if you have a different idea, because this is really important part that in the IT world we still struggle to sort of define it, right, Kevin?
Yes, and so I'd like to actually use an analogy that we use for some of the virtualization 101 training that we do with some of our account managers, right? So very simply, the cloud is a data center somewhere, right? Somewhere else. It's not some ambiguous place in the sky. It's you know, a series of racks with storage and compute nodes and RAM, and you know, they provide services, right? So kind of the difference at a very high level between, you know, private cloud and public cloud, I like to equate to traveling and vacation homes, right? So a private cloud, it's not here, it's somewhere else. It's something that you or your organization owns and that you have full unabated access to, similar to the way you would a vacation home, right? A public cloud, I like to equate to like a timeshare. Essentially, you know, somebody's built up this huge building and carved it out into individual rooms, and you're purchasing and or paying for the rights to use some of that space as you deem fit and or necessary. So that's, like I say, that's the analogy that I've used for our 101 training on the virtualization. You know, again, it's essentially a data center somewhere that you either own and can spin up and access resources from, or something that somebody else owns that you are paying for use rights to.
You know, that's actually, you know, a pretty good description. So essentially, Kevin, what you're saying is the cloud has always been there before it was ever called the cloud, right? That's what we like to say to each other. You know, as far as the IT world goes, as soon as the internet came around, the cloud pretty much could have existed. Wouldn't you agree with that?
You know, I'd have to say that for all intents and purposes, it did. You know, there's been, you know, different words and different terminologies used. You know, sometimes to create a better definition, sometimes to create a better buzz around the technology, right? But at the end of the day, yeah, it's a data center somewhere.
Right? Yeah, it's still very useful. So what I'd like to do is point out our distinguished propeller head from ShoreTel. Mr. Dean Moore. Dean, I'm so glad that you could join us. I apologize I missed you on the initial introductions. We thank you for coming around, and I was wondering, could I ask you a quick question, get you involved right away?
That'd be great. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you, I'm going to throw you a soft pitch on here on this one, right? Because
Sure.
I know as much as you would like to have stepped in on the cloud conversation, this one I think is probably one of the more important ones. And I want you to frame this high level around a conversation with, say, a CFO or a COO, right? I think that it's important that we get used to the idea of articulating a value, right? And when it comes to the idea of the benefits of virtualization, let's assume if you're in IT, you probably have an idea what the benefits of virtualization are. But I think more importantly, and what's more valuable to the rest of us, is how would you articulate that, you know, to even a higher level, to the decision makers that are the ones that write the checks to invest in virtualization. So in your mind, what are the benefits?
Oh, great question, and thanks for having me. You're right. A lot of times when we, particularly Propellerhead, and I'm glad you smiled when you say that. Propellerheads like us we start talking about virtualization in the core can drive benefits of reduced footprint in the data center and things like that, and virtualization at the desktop layer can improve security and allow you to standardize on the applications, lock down those desktops, and drive cost out of the organization that way. But when I'm speaking to non-technical folks, people higher up the chain, or people who are just line of business owners, I'm the head of the sales environment, I'm the head of the service environment, I don't really care about the technology, I need to drive my business results that I'm tasked with each quarter. I usually use the word and to try to describe virtualization as the concept of any, right? Where we want to get to is that I want to be able to access services, deploy services on any infrastructure. I don't want to care about whether it's box A or box B. I want to be able to access them on any kind of device. So I want to have my interfaces ubiquitous, right? So whether I'm a Mac user with a large MacBook, whether I'm a PC user, I'm an iPad tablet user, smartphone, I want to be able to access the resources that I need to help do my job from any kind of device, the whole BYOD thing that's very prevalent now. Also location, right? I want to be able to have access to those resources anywhere. I don't want to necessarily be tied to being in my enterprise space, right? And more of us are doing our jobs in a virtual work environment where we're either home-based or we're on the road all the time, or maybe bouncing around between different offices of my corporate environment, but I don't want to have to be in my main office to access all the tools. I need those to be available to me as I do my job wherever, whenever, and on whatever device I need to do my job. So I try to pitch it as a way for their team to have access to the productivity and business tools that they need to do the job that they're being paid for, whether that's doing sales, whether that's doing support, accounting, whatever the case may be. Let's make them available to the team all hours of the day and night, all the different devices that they're bringing to the table, because it's only a win story in that environment for the corporation, right? If their team members can access and do their job quickly and easily from anywhere, generally they're going to spend more time working in that environment and helping drive productivity and results for the company.
There's some great points there, Dean. I appreciate that. So let me throw this back over to Mike Tuttle real quickly. Mike, are there any other specific business problems that we can expect virtualization to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You know, businesses today are looking for an instant on to enable their business. For instance, marketing may come out with a new application that has to get out to the salespeople. In the past, that required quoting a server, getting purchasing to purchase that server, have it come in, get configured, tested, launched, application tested, and then rolled out to the sales folks and to the marketing team. That used to take months to do. Businesses today need the instant on of the applications and services that their users are consuming. So with virtualization, they're able to turn up servers, turn up applications, roll it out, and get their business moving faster. This doesn't just or isn't just restricted to applications anymore. With storage and network virtualization, each of these applications, each of the processes that the business needs to move forward with quickly can all be allocated in a moment's time via the templates, via the applications, via the storage, and via the network quickly and efficiently, so that their business isn't impacted, it isn't slowed down, and at times it could give them a first mover advantage against their competition. So this is the cross-pollination of technology and business helping companies move faster, make money faster, and compete against their competition. IT is no longer a hindrance to moving their business forward.
You know, that is actually a very good point, right? I mean, I think all of us here, this isn't our first rodeo. I think we've been around for a while. Things have changed for IT. It started with sort of providing a service to employees, a matter of function, right? We were sort of the mechanics that kept the machine going. Always sort of reacting to needs, right, to one of innovation where we can help drive profitability. And this goes all the way back, Dean, to your point, right? This is the conversation you want to have with a CEO or a COO or a CFO about the value that IT can bring, especially the value of virtualization. Things like agility and innovation can't work as quickly without that, right? But, you know, it's not all a wonderful thing, right? There's always going to be some challenges. And I think that that takes me to my next question. And Terry, I'd like to involve you in this one. What kind of challenges do you think that virtualization presents? Just sort of a high-level idea of what do you think those challenges might be that an IT professional could run into, whether it's from articulating it to even integrating it into their infrastructure?
Sure. So from my perspective, there's a few often overlooked requirements in virtualization. So as CPU and memory technology improves, we also improve the density of VMs on the hardware. And so with that increases the amount of Ethernet traffic and storage traffic on those devices and IOPS. So the network, in my opinion, is the most critical component of the data center. You can lose an individual server, you could lose a storage array or a drive, but if you lose that network, whether it be the Ethernet connectivity network or the SAN on your fiber channel, you lose connectivity and your entire data center ceases to exist, if you will. So most networks today are built for legacy servers, right? They're gigabit, maybe 10 gigabit, but they weren't built for the density that we're seeing today. So, your technology needs to increase into 40 gig, maybe 100 gigabit Ethernet. The next revision will be 400 gigabit Ethernet. And from a storage perspective, your SAN IOs and bandwidth becomes critical. If you can't get that, if you can't get the reads and writes up to the SAN, or vice versa, then you're going to have servers blue screening, and that's a bad thing. So many of the networks out there are still on 4 gigabit fiber channel or below in some cases, and that's just not going to cut it in the new world. We also, with the ability to move servers while they're live, in the past, servers, they spent their life on the hardware they were first installed on. You very rarely moved a server once it was installed, but now you can move that all over the place and migrate those servers, on the fly while users are still online. And so your network needs to be aware, needs to be VM aware, know where those VMs are, and auto-configure themselves so that again, you don't need to go in and configure VLANs after you vMotion a server, because that's just not going to, that takes a long time and a lot of resources. So we need the network to do that on the fly for us.
Terry, this is Jason. Yeah, leave it to the network guy to say that his component is the most important part of it. I like that. But Terry, you bring up some very good points. And let me ask Kevin on this, because I know, Kevin, you're out there, real-world experience. When customers, even when they recognize that there are all those challenges and they decide to move forward, once they're in that process of moving towards virtualization, what are some of the most common pitfalls that they run across as part of that process?
So, we see it all, right? But for the most part, what you wind up running into is and this is probably the lesser of the 3 points that I'd like to make. So would be, A would be, whoever is designing and or architecting the solution is not really understanding A, what the applications are going to require of the hardware subsystem, and what the initiatives really are. Right. Most of the clients that I work with are very diligent and very good at what they do. Right. So that kind of tends to be on the lesser side of the spectrum. A little bit more common, you'll definitely find that the C-levels, the guys that are making the decisions up above us propeller heads, wind up changing the requirements or changing the initiatives or the objectives kind of midway. But most often you find that there is sometimes a challenge justifying the additional expense or showing the ROI or the overall TCO of some added functionalities that may wind up being more of a capital expenditure up front. But at the end of the day are going to provide you with a lower TCO and a greater ROI. And so, realistically, that's kind of where we come in, and we really provide an added value is helping to show the justification for those added costs, helping to show an overall TCO, and really helping to ensure that the solution that's being presented is going to do everything that you need and want it to do and still meet your budgetary constraints.
That's very insightful, Kevin. I think that TCO and ROI have become more often used. I think you'd probably agree with me that outside of scope creep, which never happens, right? That's a unicorn. That never occurs. But the articulation of a value, right, to these to the people that we try to convince to make an investment is always going to be based on that conversation. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that as an IT director we're learning that we need to sharpen our skills is to articulate the difference between making that large initial CapEx investment, right, which a lot of times is very difficult, all the way back to Terry's point that we need to make sure the infrastructure's there so that it can perform, but then also the idea that we are paying it forward and that we'll see some additional savings down the road. And then if we're able to bolt on these other cloud solutions, we can put ourselves in a position where we can take utilization closer to that 100% mark, right? And then burst out to some cloud stuff. And you know what? We have a little extra time. Stephen, I'm interested. Do you have anything to add to that? I think that you might. To be honest with you, one of the things that we hear a lot about is not just the virtualization, but our ability to touch the cloud once in a while when we need it, which allows us to always kind of keep ourselves as utilized as possible, right?
Certainly. Well, and it's also I view the cloud as being a place where we can offer that scale. In other words, if my internal infrastructure is capable of handling a certain capacity, a certain set of loads, there are times where I have a little greater need. Classically, in traditional infrastructure investment, we've always had to over-purchase to make sure that we could handle those exceptional situations. With the cloud as being an available resource to us, we can now realistically spin some of those on-premises private cloud resources into a more public cloud space so that they're still available to us, still secured properly for us, still accessible for our users, but at the same time we're leveraging an infrastructure that isn't really ours, but we have access to it, and it gives us that greater scale. The other situation that I'm seeing more and more often is a lot of people think of their network as being the network that they have inside their own data center, and that they've got that data center sitting there, and that's where their infrastructure is. But their users are becoming more mobile. We heard that from Citrix earlier. The users are becoming more mobile, and so why am I having all those users come back to my data center when the reality is they're scattered across the state or across the country, maybe even across the world? And that's, again, where having a cloud data center working with my on-premises data center gives me easier access to those highly mobile users.
That's a good point. And I heard a word in there, secure, right? So security sort of starts to bubble up as a concern when we have our infrastructure and we're starting to reach from our private cloud into, public cloud, and the way those things are sort of reaching out and connecting the resources that we may not necessarily have control over. So Dean, I'd like to point this one at you to get some insight, because I do know that ShoreTel is getting into the public cloud side as well, and you've got to be used to hearing questions that are framed around the security problem. And I don't mean to state that there's an actual problem, but there's a question mark, right? And in the security world, any question mark is a threat. So I'd like to know maybe what your perspective is on virtualization. Do you think it really increases or decreases our security concerns when it comes to an IT environment?
I think it really highlights the importance of having an effective security policy in place to make sure you address all the concerns that come up. In some ways you could argue that it does increase the security concerns if you're leveraging a cloud service that's not on your backbone. When you can't go over and hug the server that all your data sits on and see the pretty lights flashing and it's off somewhere else, there are people who rightfully have a lot of concerns about that. What's going on there? Is there physical security in the location of the data center that I'm leveraging? How do I protect against people who are going to try to get access to that data? How do I effectively authenticate my users? So we spend, for instance, within the ShoreTel environment with our cloud offering, all of the endpoints, whether that's software-based tools or the phones that would be deployed in a customer environment, everything is secure and encrypted back into that data center. So every session that's sort of touching us from the end user into the core is encrypted and authenticated. So that becomes a very important mechanism of the security deployment. Another one is really not so much just authenticating, but what, as a user, are you enabled to do? So policies around what individual users, based on their credentials, can do. Right? I may be a valid user in the system. I may be authenticated. My session may be encrypted, but there are certain things that I may or may not be able to do. So when you're running everything in a virtualized environment, being able to have those tools to be able to segment applications as well as users within the application becomes really critical, right? Because if there's a major security hole on a virtual platform that is running 20 different apps, obviously that can create some problems. So I don't think it changes the problem. It just makes it more critical. It brings to mind, I think, for the IT organization how important security needs to be. I think in a lot of customers we talk to that have not that are in the process of moving into a virtualized environment or into a cloud environment, they maybe didn't pay as much attention to security as they should have, because it's always really, frankly, been a concern. But I think a lot of people think, well, it's in my my environment, I've got a good firewall, so I'm safe. And of course, we all know it's not that simple.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to chime in there. I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate on the security question. So kind of what I'm used to experiencing and seeing is there's really another side to the coin, right? So we obviously have the security piece. We have to maintain compliance with our industry. We have to secure and encrypt our data, both at rest and in motion. But the other side of the puzzle really is usability, right? So if it's too secure that the users don't enjoy the experience, then the buy-in from our CEOs, executives, CFOs, it's not going to be fully supported. So we really want to ensure, I think, across the board and in any business or industry that users still get the flexibility they need to access their apps, their desktops, their data across all their devices with things like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. But also we need to have the security to maintain compliance, and it's kind of more of a proactive dance and really finding that happy medium where both parties can play.
That's a great point, Jordan. And I know that Citrix plays a lot in the security world because you guys are so active in the mobility side, and I know that just like cloud, security is brought up a lot when it comes to mobility. So I'm sure you have some insights that were quite valuable. Now, I do have another question though, and Kevin, I'm gonna direct this one at you. We've been talking an awful lot about the benefits of virtualizing an environment. I'm wondering, is there a benefit to waiting it out? Is there a benefit? Is there a measurable economic benefit to anybody that is, chooses to wait out virtualization altogether?
So I'm not sure that waiting it out altogether is logistically possible, right? If you're looking for less resiliency, less redundancy, less performance, and a higher operational cost, then yes, absolutely, you should most decidedly wait on virtualization. I joke. Maybe so. If you're the type of organization where you have, maybe you've offloaded all of your services to cloud offerings, right? Maybe you have, your email in the cloud, and you've got your, your ERP or your CRM application being hosted. Maybe the only server that you have on site is just a single domain controller, and you're using it to authenticate your computers. Then maybe we don't virtualize, right? But aside from that, again, the benefits far outweigh anything else, even if we're talking about capital expenditure. So like I say, maybe you just don't have the money, or maybe you're in a position where you've only got the single server. I'm sure that there's going to be arguments against that too. But regardless, there are going to be very few use cases where it really makes sense to not virtualize.
And so, Kevin, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here.
I figured you might, Stephen.
I'm going to do that. The way I view it, and this is actually a view that I've received from a number of Microsoft partners as well, is that at this day and age, virtualization is sophisticated enough and is stable enough that pretty much you should just virtualize anything. I don't care what the size of your business is, you can get into virtualization for zero to almost no cost. Microsoft views virtualization as being an essential element of the operating system, so every one of our servers ships with a virtualization hypervisor, and so anybody can virtualize. And the real advantage, if you virtualize from day one, you then have all kinds of choices from then on. You can go to a load balance situation of multiple machines, or you can go and perform a live migration between machines, or you can go and start taking your virtual machines from on-premises into the cloud, into a hosted infrastructure. You gain flexibility because you started virtualizing from the very beginning, and I truly don't believe that it is a significant investment difference in cost, that your cost to start virtualizing from day one is nominal, and your benefits in the long run are truly spectacular relative to the investment up front. So I think everybody should seriously look at virtualization from the very beginning.
And Stephen, to add to that point, you're absolutely right. The price delta between, especially in a much smaller environment, the price delta is relatively nominal as far as implementing virtualization. And while it certainly doesn't, and nothing really can future-proof your physical hardware infrastructure, it certainly goes towards future-proofing your infrastructure model. And at the end of the day, if you've offloaded your email or your CRM or any applications to the cloud, well, guess what? You've already virtualized.
That's very true. That's true. And I think any environment that claims they're not virtualized needs to take a second look at their environment. They probably are somewhere, right, Kevin?
Absolutely.
So we're getting to the last segment here, right? So we do have a question where when we asked around from the Vology side, what would be a good sort of what-if question, we did have one that we thought would be interesting, and I really felt I want to sort of articulate to you guys as I asked the question, there's no limitations. Anything from utopian Jetsons ideas on virtualization all the way out to what you think is going to happen tomorrow on your next integration. I'd like to know from each of you guys. And what I'll do is I'll call you guys out one at a time and go down the line. And then Jason, I think, has been accumulating some questions from the audience. Jason, if you are prepared, we'll stop with you and find out what questions the audience may have had.
That works for me, yeah.
Okay, great. So, guys, I'm going to actually go out of order. I'm going to start with the gentleman from ShoreTel, Dean. So here's your question. If you can kind of give us the quick 30-second, right, if you can, if it's possible. What does the future hold for virtualization in your mind?
I think the idea that I can leverage virtualization in multiple modes, meaning I can seamlessly move from potentially services and resources that are available within my enterprise environment in my brick and mortar space, have access to them seamlessly as I transition out of that environment on whatever device I may be having, let's say an iPad, for example, where I can seamlessly transfer, in a sense, the files that I'm using, for example, into the cloud as I move out of that environment. So sort of a location awareness that the environment that I'm working in sort of understands where I'm at, what's the best mode to automatically access the resources I need. Am I on-prem? Do I have some local servers distributed that I can pull my applications from? Am I out and about in the world and I need to leverage maybe a streamlined, more efficient app, leveraging the same data that seamlessly moves from device to a device because I happen to be on an iPad using a 4G connection, for example. So that'd be a little wish list kind of thing that would be nice to see, location awareness, basically.
That's cool. I know that there's a little bit of location awareness out there already, right, from the wireless world and mobility. Yeah. So let me move this over to James, our friend from Nutanix. James, where do you see virtualization, in the future?
Yeah, Dean. So I think we've talked about server virtualization and why you really at this point should be doing that. I think the next logical step is, seeing the progression of this software-defined networking, software-defined storage, really just a fully automated data center where you have that easy ability to automate processes, wrap SLAs around different types of workloads, whether it be services, whether it be network services or compute. Being able to seamlessly migrate from a public cloud to a hybrid cloud. So today we've obviously got some integration pieces, but being able to take a running virtual machine, inside my walls of my data center and migrating that out into the cloud real time, seamlessly. I see things kind of going in that direction. And then, not just because I work for Nutanix, but I see the infrastructure changing to where we go to more of a model where we're going to, leverage more commodity hardware and get away from, some of the three-tier SAN model architectures that we see today, and go back to kind of a software-driven, commodity hardware model.
Okay, all right, that's sort of near future. Jordan, so let me ask you a question. The same one, right? Where do you see the future going? Is Citrix going to be streaming desktops to our retinas, or what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, and I think that's really a great question, right? So we talked a little bit about the history, we talked about the different types, but when we look at the future of virtualization, it's really about on-demand, right? So enterprises need to be on-demand. They need to accommodate for seasonal changes in demand as their business grows or to scale accordingly. But all the while, we have to kind of focus on the key themes that we talked about: centralized management, secure infrastructure, not jeopardizing user experience. And I think that's kind of where Citrix comes into play, is while the left and the right components are changing, keeping that middle experience consistent for the end users is really an important consideration.
Okay, great. Another grounded future look, right? I appreciate that. I'm waiting for someone to tell me about cyborgs or artificial intelligence, or maybe managing my phone as one virtual chassis with your core network or something silly like that. So, Tuttle, let me ask you, do you have anything out there, or where do you think virtualization is going to go?
Well, I'll start with, I hope you can virtualize my phone. I'm one of those unlucky people that carries two of them, so if you can get me a virtual chassis in my phone, I'd be very happy about that. But really leads to a great point here. One of the things I see in the future of virtualization is we're finally going to stop talking about virtualization in the form of silos. All of us as manufacturers love to sit here and say, hey, I do network virtualization, I do SAN virtualization, I do server virtualization. We're still talking about silos, the same silos we talked about in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s here. I definitely see the future getting to a point where we bring it all together and we start talking about converged virtual infrastructure rather than the silos. And a little bit more development needed there, but I certainly see that coming soon.
So any onboard servers and Juniper switches in the future for us?
I can't comment on rumors or futures, you know that.
Come on. All right, so let's get over to Captain Cloud, Mr. Deming from Microsoft. Stephen, what do you think? Are you going to give us something exciting?
So I actually think a lot of the exciting things are already here in many cases. I mean, there have been so many advances in virtualization and cloud technologies that we're just now starting to figure out how to take advantage of. But frankly, I've heard some really great points. Dean talking about that the end user experience and virtualization around that. That Jason talking about the server virtualization. Frankly, I want to see it made easier. I want to see it made more ubiquitous. I really want to see solid management tools that really let us control this, but at the same time really enable our end users to take full advantage of it. I mean, that's the future that I'm seeing.
That's good. That's good. So that takes us to our esteemed propeller head from Brocade. Terry, do we have Star Trek in the future, man? Are you going to take us someplace exciting, or what do you think the future holds?
Yeah, maybe not that exciting, but I think certainly it's about the application controlling the resources. So the application knows how much bandwidth it needs, it knows how much storage it needs, how much CPU it needs, and it knows where it needs to go. And so it's about that application telling the resources what it needs and having it build those dynamically on the fly. And when it's done with them, have it tear them down and release them to other applications. So it's all about automation and hands-off configuration. And that's in conjunction with SDN and network function virtualization can make that a reality. So we're not far out. We just need we need the vendors to talk and build a single infrastructure.
Okay, I think that's great. So we're gonna start the last segment here, Jason. I'm not sure how many questions we're gonna have time for. We're trying to wrap this up, I think, in the next 5 minutes or so. So,
Sure.
Jason, I'm sure you accumulated some. Do you have any good questions from the audience?
We've got a couple here, and this one is probably more suited for Jordan at Citrix. So the question from Steve was, our biggest virtualization challenge is the number of devices that our employees expect to use both in and out of the office. So obviously that presents somewhat of a challenge when you're trying to virtualize, and you can't virtualize to any particular device or platform. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and that's one of the tremendous things, right? So we talked a lot about BYOD, or bring your own device initiatives, and historically we'll say that, you know, it's amazing to call BYOD historic at this point, but the norm now is that consumers are bringing their own devices into our environment, whether we like it or not. So now it's all about a challenge of managing our data, managing our applications, and securing those devices, whether they be BYO or corporately owned devices. Now, Citrix obviously has a number of great solutions for that, but we have to think of the end user's perspective, right? So a mobile workspace, how do we define a mobile workspace? And it's really the ability for a user to access their apps, to access their data, their services, their IT infrastructure with a true follow-me cloud-like solution without jeopardizing security. So that's where the device really, again, becomes less important, and we focus more, again, like we said, on the software and the applications that are being pumped through that channel.
Good stuff. Thanks, Jordan. One other thing, Neil, we've got time for one more?
I do. I think we have time for maybe even two more.
Okay, you got it. So the next one actually, and this goes back to Stephen, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but Microsoft Azure. There's a question from Jeff that says, I've heard a lot about Microsoft Azure. How does that fit within the cloud virtualization discussions?
So Microsoft Azure is actually, it sort of has two personalities that we should be aware of. Its more legacy personality is that it was originally rolled out as a development platform for developing new cloud applications. More recently, for basically the last year, Azure has also provided an infrastructure as a service platform where you can either spin up a new server in the cloud or take an existing server that you have on premises and move it over to Azure in the cloud. Effectively, as I was describing earlier, giving you the ability to use the cloud as a way of scaling your on-premises infrastructure, or if you'd rather, basically moving your on-premises resources into the cloud. We view that as being very beneficial for what we call line of business solutions. The cloud in general provides a lot of software as a service solutions, things like email and so forth. But for line of business, being able to virtualize on premises or being able to virtualize in the infrastructure in the cloud, that's where we see Azure as playing a very valid role.
Great. Good stuff, Steve.
I think we have a question for one more, Jason. You have something good?
I do. This is actually specifically for Nutanix. So, Jim, this one's heading your way. The question is, with Nutanix in an existing virtualized environment, specifically, what's the compatibility? If there's existing servers and existing hypervisors, how do you introduce your solution or a solution into an environment where there's already some existing virtualization that's happened?
So that's a good question. So today we don't have any integration with your legacy infrastructure per se. So you're not going to necessarily use your existing compute resources and talk to Nutanix. With that said, if you wanted to reach out of the Nutanix, if you were using IP storage, whether it be NFS or iSCSI, because the actual the host itself is just a standard host on your network, you would be able to leverage existing storage infrastructure if you had that in place. But we kind of see our platform as being a fully integrated solution where you would lose a lot of if you're aware of the architecture. If you have seen any of our presentations, our architecture really benefits by having the actual compute workload running within the Nutanix platform. And we do that with some different technologies where we actually run your active data set on the local SSD drives. So running it outside, you would actually lose those benefits.
Jason, I'd like to add to that that question real quick. So as a solutions architect, I have the luxury of being vendor agnostic, right? And so, oftentimes I get asked that question by a customer who's looking to either expand their virtualization infrastructure or implement a virtualized environment, right? Oftentimes equipment can be repurposed, but ultimately, we need to come in and take a look at what you have and ultimately what you want to do with the equipment, and that's really going to determine whether the existing equipment can be re-leveraged. Sometimes you have issues with processor compatibility or just hardware compatibility in general. Sometimes there are. So vCenter needs to, best practices says it's a standalone server. Microsoft says that best practices you have a standalone domain controller outside of your environment. And so sometimes we can re-leverage some of the better equipment that you have for stuff like that. Again, it really just depends on what you need and want to do, and let someone come in and take a look at it and really be able to determine what can be reappropriated or not.
And you know what, Kevin? I think that's a great message to end this with, right? We couldn't have had this conversation without the collective mind share of everybody that's here, and this is a pretty formidable bunch, right? And I think the same thing rings true with the partner that you choose to be your trusted advisor when it comes to evaluating where you are and what your future state needs to be, and putting together a blueprint that will sort of guide the path in the right direction, all driven on priorities that are dictated by your business. And so you need a partner that will do that, and Vology is really one of the most impressive. 50 engineers are on staff, and just look at this right here. For an hour, we've been able to bring together all of the strongest vendors, some of the strongest vendors that we carry at Vology, and this is just a touch of it. So imagine what we could do on your network. Imagine how we can help your business, and make sure you engage your account manager to see what other values that Vology can provide, because I promise you every customer will be surprised at all of the other things that Vology can do. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this meeting. Those of you in the audience, we really do appreciate that, and the vendors that put aside the time to go through this with us and have this discussion. I really hope that you guys would be interested in returning, because I think that there's a lot more for us to talk about. Maybe we can get into a deeper dive. And on a last note, for the listeners out there, Twitter. Follow us on Twitter, folks. It's at Vology Inc. So be sure to get on there and follow us, or you can follow the good-looking engineer with the black background. What's your Twitter handle, Kevin? If you don't mind sharing that.
Oh, you're talking about me? Oh, I do have a black background, huh? So it's at just K-Ray. So that's JUSTKREY, as in, it's just K-Ray.
That's right. And the reason why we point that out is because Kevin does a lot of social media work. We work together, and you will see a lot of activity from that. And then once again, Google Plus as well. Make sure you follow us there. So from those of us here in the Silicon Valley of the South, Vology in Tampa, to the rest of the world, we appreciate you guys giving us your time. And once again, thank you everybody on the board here. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it.
Take care. Thanks.
Take care.
But basically, he had this kind of idea and theme to really allow multiple users to connect to a session, leverage an operating system at the same time. So Citrix and Microsoft have always been very key players in the virtualization space. We have a very strategic partnership. And now we kind of fast forward to 2003. The University of Cambridge releases the first open source hypervisor called Zen, later acquired by Citrix. And now, modern day, present day, we have this tremendous advancement in virtualization technology, enterprise mobility, enterprise flexibility, workplace reinventions, software-defined data centers. And I think that's actually a good point to even hand it off to James to talk about some of the types of virtualization that exist.
Well, hey, I guess you're great at reading minds, Jordan. That's exactly who we were going to go to next. James, how are we? Is your mic okay now?
Can you guys hear me now?
Beautiful. We can hear you. So everybody, let me formally introduce the esteemed gentleman in a similar background as mine with the goofy headset on. That is James with Nutanix. James, why don't you tell us first a little bit about what you do for Nutanix before I ask you this question?
Absolutely. So yep, my name's James McNeil. I'm a senior systems engineer with Nutanix, which is basically a nice title for a pre-sales engineer. So I'm responsible for the Florida territory and as well as Bermuda, basically driving the technical side of the sales process, as well as doing some post-sales installation type work and working with new customers to get things ramped up.
Great. So another propeller head. So we got a handful of those here, right? So James, let me ask you. I think this is really a relevant question for Nutanix. Because one of the problems that Nutanix or any converged solution is trying to do is break down silos, right? So one of the things that comes to mind after we get an overview of virtualization and maybe some ideas on history. What types of virtualization exist out there? How would you sort of categorize them?
So I think I'd really categorize it. I'd start with, I guess, server virtualization. So, today we're kind of at the point now where, the standard is to virtualize, right? Most organizations have that virtualize first mindset, and then, go to physical.
Partner technology strategist from Microsoft.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well. Tell us about what you do.
So I'm part of our East Region field support team. I provide technical support for our customers and partners, specifically to help customers and partners understand where Microsoft technology is today, where it's going in the future, and ultimately how to better engage with Microsoft.
That's great. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, are some of my fellow Vologians. Jason Welsh, the world's tallest product manager. Jason, can you tell us what you do over here at Vology?
Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, I am a very tall product manager, but no, I'm one of Neil's colleagues, and I manage several of the virtualization product lines here at Vology. So very happy to be with you guys here this afternoon.
That's great. Jason's going to play the co-host role with us, so we hopefully, Jason, will get an opportunity to talk to a few of you guys and ask you a few additional questions. And then last and certainly not least, world-famous solutions architect from Vology, possibly the prettiest engineer on the planet, Kevin Reynolds. Kevin, can you tell us what you do over at Vology?
Oh, Neil, what a fantastic introduction. Thank you. And for what it's worth, you only say that because it's true. So my name is Kevin Reynolds. I'm one of the senior solutions architects here with Vology. I play in the data center, so server storage and virtualization primarily. That's what we do.
Well, that sounds good, Kevin. So I'm going to point the first question at you. So if you could give us sort of a high-level explanation or definition, essentially, of what virtualization actually is.
Sure. So virtualization, realistically, is nothing more than software that provides an abstraction layer between the hardware and the operating system, if you will. So it essentially slides in between the hardware and the operating system, and it tricks the operating systems into believing that they have their own dedicated hardware resources. So it essentially allows us to condense our hardware platform by running many virtual machines on top of a single piece of hardware.
Good afternoon, everybody. Neil from Vology. I'm the Enterprise Group Product Manager. I am very pleased to have gathered the guests that we have here today. We have several of them from many vendors, all of which you guys have probably heard of before. And they are very distinguished friends that have worked with us for quite a while. And I'm excited to introduce them to you. The first person is Jordan Goldman from Citrix. He's a technical analyst. Jordan, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Citrix?
Hey, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Jordan Goldman. I'm a technical analyst here at Citrix, and I work with the inside and field sales teams to kind of support our enterprise customers, certainly from a mobility stance or a virtualization stance, both in and outside of the field.
Thank you, Jordan. That's great. Our next esteemed guest is James McNeil, Senior Systems Engineer with Nutanix. James, can you tell us what you do at Nutanix?
James is muted, I believe.
I believe so.
All right, James. Apparently, James is having some technical issues. We'll come back to James in a moment. Let's get over to Michael Tuttle. Michael from Juniper, Senior Partner Account Manager over at Juniper. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about what you do over at Juniper?
I can. Thank you for having me today. My name is Michael Tuttle. My primary responsibility is to provide training, enablement, program services to our partner community, Vology being our lead partner here in Florida. And that's, in a nutshell, what I do. Thank you for having me today.
Our pleasure. Our next guest is Terry Henry from Brocade. Terry is a Senior Systems Engineer. Terry, can you tell us a little bit about what you do over at Brocade?
Sure, thanks for having me. I'm the Senior Systems Engineer, as you said. I cover our channel partners throughout the state of Florida, and I cover distribution for all of North America.
Great. Stephen Deming.
If it's something that can't be virtualized, which there's not much left today that can't be. It's oftentimes, I guess now we're calling it private cloud. And today, over 50% of server workloads are virtualized. Gartner sees that going to 86% by 2016. So it's clear that's where the market's going, and that's, server virtualization is a matured, use case for virtualization. We have desktop virtualization now, and I think, over the last 3 or 4 years, we consistently hear, this is the year of VDI, this is the year of VDI. And each year we get more and more penetration into that VDI space, typically adopted for that, ease of management of the desktops, bringing that security model in place where your actual desktops live inside the walls of your data center, reducing the cost of these upgrades. And then I think, to Citrix's point, the whole BYOD initiative really drives that VDI use case as well for virtualization. A couple of the newer spaces I see with types of virtualization that are starting to become more and more relevant is the idea of software-defined networking, where we're basically abstracting that underlying physical network infrastructure and putting all the services in that software layer above these commodity network gear, and really just making that data center fully programmable, being able to centrally manage our networking stack from these software-defined networking controllers in your data center, and having that view of the entire data center, from one pane of glass. VMware bought Nicira and rolled that into their NSX platform. Cisco with ACI, a couple of the big players in that space. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And then storage. So, the idea of abstracting the storage functionality into the actual software layer that lives above, essentially, their commodity gear, or really just not even caring what that underlying network gear is. Virtualizing it and putting the functionality of enterprise storage like dedupe, compression, thin provisioning, replications, snapshots in that actual, virtualizing that and putting that in that software layer.
It's interesting to hear you mention that, Jim. And first of all, before I go on, despite what Neil says, the headset looks fantastic. No, because I've heard a lot about the others, but maybe not so much about.
Well, that's interesting, right? So one of the more interesting pieces that will open up as dialogue continues is that this idea of virtualization is gone much further than just servers, right? It may have started there. Actually, may have started someplace else. Why don't I point the next question to Jordan? Jordan's with Citrix. Citrix is really one of the founders of commercialized virtualization. So I think probably the right person to ask the question is, Jordan, can you give us sort of a high-level timeline on the history of virtualization? Is this something that's brand new?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So to kind of figure out where we are today, right, it's really important to trace it back to the roots of virtualization. So a long, long time ago in a data center far away, basically we had these massive computers that could only handle a single task. Now, granted, they could handle that task very well, but basically as the times changed, these computers grew stronger and stronger, the technology evolved and evolved, so processors became more and more important, but they were still handling that one task. Now we kind of transition over to where the virtualization came in and advancements in that, right? So virtualization solved the problem of overcrowded data centers, of underutilized CPUs, and also allowed each virtual machine to act in its own instance in isolation. So great for scalability, great for on-demand adding of network resources. Now, if we look at kind of an early time frame, I mentioned that it started in the early 1960s, and it actually was a project by IBM. So a little company called IBM, we may know them, started it actually in the 1964 era, and they wanted to design a computer that would allow a computer to do multitask at once, as well as allow multiple users to interact with that server in the same time. Now we fast forward a little bit down the road to 1972, we actually have a concept of virtual memory, so allowing the processor to handle more than one task simultaneously. Fast forward a few more years down the road, we actually have the founding of Microsoft by Bill Gates up in the 1975, and then Intel actually released a 8086 chip that would support a guest operating system. At the time, it ran Microsoft MS-DOS. Fast forward a little bit more, Citrix is founded by an IBM developer, Eddie Akabuchi, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year.